The terminal doors slid shut behind him, leaving Carlos in the humid rush of the airport exit. He stood motionless. The city stretched out before him, a sprawling grid of glass and concrete that seemed to hum with an indifference he could feel in his bones. He shifted his weight, his grip tightening on the handle of his single suitcase. $300. That was the entire sum of his existence, tucked into the leather of his wallet. He watched the crowd disperse, people moving in steady, purpose-driven streams toward waiting cars and trains. He was an island in that tide. He took a breath, the air tasting of exhaust and hot asphalt. He did not look for a taxi. He did not look for a familiar face. He stepped away from the terminal, his boots hitting the pavement with a sharp, rhythmic sound. He began to walk. The distance to the city center was long, but he kept his eyes on the skyline, mapping his route by the streetlights flickering to life. Every step felt like a choice. He checked his pocket once more, felt the solid weight of the cash, and kept moving forward into the growing shadows. That night, he signed for a bunk in a room shared by 4 men. The space was tight, airless, and smelled of stale sweat. He lay on a thin mattress while the constant, low-frequency hum of traffic rattled the window pane. Sleep was thin and broken. Before dawn, he was already moving. He walked 3 miles to a construction site, boots heavy on the cracked sidewalk. When he reached the gate, he found the foreman. He did not speak. He simply opened his palms, showing the calloused skin, and nodded. The work began immediately. He hauled brick after brick, his muscles screaming under the weight until the sun dipped behind the skyline. His shoulders burned with a dull, throbbing heat. That evening, he bought a single loaf of bread and a gallon of water. He retreated to his bunk, pulled out a small, worn notebook, and turned to the first page. He wrote $300. With a steady hand, he subtracted the bus fare and his share of the rent. He calculated the remainder, recorded the total, and closed the book. The margin of his survival was shrinking, but the numbers were now under his control. Weeks bled into months, each day a carbon copy of the last. The construction site was a battlefield of dust and heavy loads, but the wages were not enough to satisfy the hunger growing in his mind. He needed more. He needed acceleration. He began to hunt for a second source of income. He found it in the late-night hours, scrubbing floors in vacant office buildings. While the rest of the city retreated into sleep, Carlos entered the quiet, sterile lobbies. He hauled buckets of gray water across polished tiles. He emptied trash cans filled with the debris of other people's workday. The silence was his only companion. He worked until his back ached and his vision blurred, scrubbing the same spots until the linoleum shined like a mirror. He never stopped to sit. He never slowed his pace. Every hour he spent in those empty halls was an hour purchased toward his future. He existed in a state of perpetual motion, his life reduced to a cycle of labor and survival. He was exhausted, but the tally in his mind grew with every floor he finished. He was building a wall between his current reality and the life he intended to claim. Sundays were no longer for rest. When the sun rose, Carlos bypassed the park and headed straight for the public library. He claimed a table in the back corner, surrounding himself with stacks of books on finance, real estate, and the mechanics of compound interest. He marked pages with precise, calculated strokes of a pen. He was not just reading, he was building a blueprint. He highlighted passages on organized planning, his eyes tracing the math until the words blurred. One afternoon, a coworker stopped by his desk, gesturing toward the door. "We are heading to the bar. Carlos, come, have a drink." Carlos looked up, his expression neutral. He looked at his notebook, then back at the man. "No," he said, his voice clipped and dry, as the man walked away. Carlos picked up his pencil. He calculated the cost of that single drink, then factored in what that money would be worth in 10 years through compound interest. He wrote the total in his ledger with a heavy, final pressure. The social gap between him and the rest of the world was widening. He did not care. He was trading temporary connection for permanent independence, 1 hour at a time. The day arrived when the numbers in his ledger finally reached the threshold. $1,000. It was a small sum to the rest of the world, but to Carlos, it represented every drop of sweat from the construction site and every hour spent scrubbing office floors. He sat at a terminal in the library, his hands resting on the desk. He logged into the brokerage platform. The interface was stark, blinking with a cursor that seemed to count down the seconds. He entered the amount. He checked the ticker symbols twice, his fingers hovering over the key. This was the moment the cycle of survival had to break. He pressed enter. The screen flashed, confirming the purchase of low-cost index funds. He watched the balance appear, a flickering digital line that no longer required his physical presence to grow. He stared at the screen until his eyes burned. For the first time in his life, the money was moving on its own. It was a quiet, almost invisible shift, but it changed everything. He was no longer just a laborer hauling bricks or cleaning floors. He was an owner. He closed the laptop, stood up, and left the library. The sun was still high, and for the first time, he walked without the weight of his previous exhaustion. The market did not move in a straight line. Weeks after his first purchase, the screen turned red. The ticker symbols bled downward, and his initial $1,000 began to shrivel. Carlos watched the balance drop, the numbers flickering lower with every refresh. His pulse quickened. The urge to sell, to salvage what remained and stop the bleeding, pulled at his mind like a physical weight. He stared at the screen, his jaw set, and remembered the math. He closed the browser. He did not sell. Instead, he walked to the construction site and signed up for every available weekend shift. He hauled drywall until his muscles screamed and his skin was coated in grit. Every extra hour earned was a new share purchased at a discount. While others lamented the market crash, Carlos calculated the yield. He treated the volatility not as a disaster, but as a clearance sale. He returned to his room, ate his bread, and logged back in. The balance was lower, but his share count had climbed. He was no longer trading safety for growth. He was buying the storm itself. He kept his eyes on the ledger, unmoved by the chaos of the ticker. The morning of his 40th birthday, the air in the small room felt different. Carlos sat at his desk, the same table where he had logged every cent for 2 decades. He opened his brokerage portal. The numbers had grown, but today, they told a different story. He pulled out the worn notebook, flipped to the current page, and began the math. He calculated the projected dividend payments for the month. He compared the sum against his rent, his grocery costs, and his utilities. He ran the numbers 3 times, fingers tapping rhythmically on the wood. The total matched. The rent was covered by the dividends alone. He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. The constant, low-level hum of survival that had occupied his mind since he arrived with $300 suddenly went silent. A weight he had not realized he was carrying lifted from his chest. He looked out the window at the morning traffic, but he was no longer part of the frantic rush. The machine he had built, piece by piece, share by share, was finally sustaining itself. He closed his eyes, a steady, calm pulse of confidence taking hold. He had reached the pivot point. He was no longer working to live. He was living on the interest of his own discipline. The final stretch was not a sprint, but a steady climb. Carlos watched the account balance crawl upward, day after day, week after week. He kept his routine rigid. He stayed in the same apartment. He drove the same vehicle. He ignored the lifestyle creep that claimed his peers. One Tuesday morning, he logged in. The total sat at $998,000. He watched the ticker for an hour. The numbers flickered, dipped, then pushed higher. 999,000. He felt no urge to celebrate, only a cold, mechanical focus. The market surged. The screen refreshed. The number hit $1,200,000. He sat in the silence of his room, the cursor blinking on the screen. He pulled the original notebook from the shelf. He looked at the first page. $300. The gap between that initial desperate sum and the current balance was vast, yet it was bridged by the same repetitive, disciplined actions. He had turned 300 into 1,000,000 through simple, relentless subtraction and reinvestment. The machine was complete. He closed the laptop, placed his hands flat on the desk, and took a slow, deep breath. The long grind was over. Carlos walked through the lobby, his stride measured and deliberate. He reached the office door, knocked once, and stepped inside. His boss looked up from a stack of files. Expecting the usual report on the week's progress, Carlos did not stop at the guest chair. He walked to the desk, placed a single sheet of paper on the surface, and kept his hand on it for a heartbeat. The boss read the letter, brow furrowing, looking up with a question that Carlos did not wait to answer. He turned, walked toward the exit, and pushed through the heavy glass doors. The transition was immediate. He crossed the threshold from the stale, climate-controlled air of the office into the sharp, warm light of the afternoon. He walked into the center of the sidewalk and stopped. The city noise continued around him, honking horns, distant sirens, the rush of foot traffic, but he was no longer tethered to any of it. He took a breath, feeling the air fill his lungs without the weight of impending deadlines or quotas. He looked up at the sun, then turned his back on the building. For the first time in his adult life, the hours ahead belonged entirely to him. Carlos pulled his car into the driveway and killed the engine. The silence that followed was absolute. He stepped out, walked to the front door, and inserted the key. The lock clicked, the door swung inward, and he stepped into the foyer. He placed his keys on the entry table, the metal ringing against the wood. He moved to a chair near the window, his movements slow and deliberate. Outside, the garden was still. He reached into his bag and pulled out the small, worn notebook. The edges were frayed, the paper yellowed from years of constant use. He flipped past the pages of calculations, the lists of rent, the bus fares, and the grocery tallies. He reached the final blank page. He took a pen, held it steady, and pressed the tip to the paper. His hand did not tremble. He wrote the 3 words clearly: mission accomplished. He set the pen down and closed the book. The weight that had defined his existence for decades, the need to track, to save, to sacrifice, evaporated. He leaned back, looked out at the light shifting across the grass, and let his hands rest at his sides. The labor was finished. The future was now entirely his own.